Så far tror jeg overgeleerd ik leer Bergin in Milena. It's Misha Fang Jichu, so I'm Fang Jichu, the associate professor here in the School of Irish Celtic Studies and Folklore. So it's tradition here for us to host the Osborn Bergin Memorial Lecture every year. It's the third consecutive year. We've been running this since the pandemic. So just to announce, before introducing the speaker to you tonight, just to say the tradition is there's no Q&A session after this talk, but there will be a reception upstairs in Jean Cadre on the second floor, so you can follow us up there afterwards. There will be nibbles and some drinks available, so you can talk to the speaker tonight. And our very distinguished speaker tonight is no other than Professor Greg Toner himself, the Professor of Irish in Queen's University Belfast since 2011. He is a member of the Royal Academy and, of course, the chair of the management committee of the RA's very useful folklore Starú na Gaeilge, but also more useful, the director of the YDIL itself. So his topic tonight would be Allegory and History in Medieval Ireland. And there's a handout if you haven't got one, so I can get one for you. So let's welcome Greg with a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Frankie, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted and honoured to be given the Bergin Memorial Lecture. Yes, under this title, Allegory and History, the dominant model, I suppose, of early Irish narrative literature throughout the 20th century has been fiction. This approach has been challenged substantially in this century and is now widely accepted that authors and redactors were working with primarily historiographical mode, certainly within the early medieval Ulster cycle and probably also in the King's cycle. In fact, however, the historiographical intent of medieval Irish tale-tellers was well understood in the 20th century. Gareth McGowan observes of the tales, and I quote, "For the men who handed them down, they were not detached pieces of exciting fiction, but part of the history of their people." And David Green noted that the main interest of 11th century scholars was Shenahis, which they believed in, he says, as implicitly as they did in the Bible. The fact that the tales fail to conform to modern historiographical standards should not blind us to the fact that that is precisely how they were treated by authors, redactors, and glossators in the Middle Ages. We must remember that all history is narrative, but for the medieval Irish, Shenahis was factually true. For this reason, the term pseudo-history is best avoided, as the writers of history undoubtedly believed in the process, even if their methods would now be regarded as deficient. They did not necessarily set out to deceive, although sometimes they did that too, and the broad framework held the intellectual ground down to Keating and really into the 19th century. However, the fluid boundaries between history and fiction still permit, indeed demand, literary consideration of the texts. Medieval historical writing could contain an element of fiction, helping to fulfill its didactic function as a persuasive art. Imagined speeches and even descriptions of battle or warriors would have been regarded as plausible rather than factual, and they were intended to imbue a text with an air of verisimilitude. One genre that has been the subject of more intensive and probing analysis in recent years is allegory. Although this is seen as coming out of Christian exegetical interpretation of the Bible, it is invariably discussed as a form of fiction and thereby diametrically opposed to historiography. Elizabeth Boyle has attempted to establish some ground rules for the genre through an examination of the more obvious examples of the genre, such as dreams and other narratives which are embedded within a more interpretive text. Karen Hollow, following a distinguished line stretching back through Kim McCone to James Carney, proposed an extended allegorical reading of Eachtra Chunla, which we'll revisit shortly. Although she acknowledges that some of the characters of the tale have their roots in an historical framework and would have been understood by the author and audience as real people, she nevertheless takes the tale to be, I quote, a piece of deliberate fiction. In this paper, I hope to question an understanding of what constitutes an allegory and come to a view of how allegory and historiography might be considered together as complementary forms. Medievalists will be aware of two distinct forms of allegory. An allegory can be wholly invented, so the story is composed in order to illustrate a deeper meaning, thereby enabling the author to convey abstract thought in narrative form, as for example in parables or political allegory. This is often called compositional allegory and may generally be placed in the fiction section of a bookshop. It must be distinguished from what we may call interpretive allegory, often now called allegoresis. In allegoresis, an existing narrative is interpreted on another non-literal level in order to discover a deeper meaning within the text. Both categories involve the reader deciphering a hidden meaning lying under the surface narrative, but compositional allegory may be understood as a method of writing narrative which is then read for its hidden meaning. By contrast, interpretive allegory is a mode of reading an existing text. In both, the reader detects a hidden meaning within the text, but whereas this is built in by the author in a compositional allegory to be found by the reader, in allegoresis, it is purely a top-down reading constructed by the reader. Allegoresis is most commonly found in the Middle Ages in biblical exegesis, but it has been shown, for example, by Karnaholo and Krivoshenkova, that this methodology was also applied to non-biblical texts. In Christian allegoresis, a passage must be interpreted according to orthodox teaching, particularly where it may contain material which was viewed as problematic, and a text that seemed to be indecent or unfitting was always to be read figuratively. Zhang defines allegoresis as, I quote, a mode of interpretation that works to bring a text in line with certain ideological presumptions. As Rawlinson observes of Augustine's teaching on allegoresis, I quote, the interpreter of the Bible is mutatis mutandis, to coordinate the obscure point with the obvious one, to learn the unknown by its suitable, appropriate relationship with the known. In this way, inconsistencies and sordidness can be explained away and the text integrated into the canon. I promise some more discussion here of inconsistencies and a little bit of sordidness in what follows. But there's a very important point here. While compositional allegory seems opposed to history, allegoresis is entirely compatible with historical narrative and was invariably applied to what were perceived as historical texts in medieval exegesis. It should be noted that medieval scholars could easily switch between historical and allegorical reading of biblical narrative. The text was believed both to be historically true, in that the events depicted within it were believed to have occurred as depicted, but that they also contain meaning and significance beyond what existed on the surface. For example, the Great Flood was believed to have been literally true, but Noah was thought to presage Christ, and the ark represented the salvation of the chosen few from the wrath of God. In recent years, Éachtra Chonla has been treated as an allegory which presents a thoroughly Christian message. There now seems to be universal agreement among scholars about its innate Christian teaching, and there seems little doubt that it can be read allegorically. However, the allegorical reading has produced some anomalies, notably in the appearance of a sexual element, and particularly of the land of women. Considerable effort has been expended in attempts to explain how such images could have been conjured up by the author. However, I believe that they can be accommodated within the norms of medieval allegoresis, the aim of which was often, as we've seen, to detoxify unedifying material in biblical texts. The inclusion of biblical allusions within the tale is undeniable. McCone notes that the apple and that the woman throws to Conla evokes the Adam and Eve story, and indeed, it is difficult to imagine a medieval reader not being prompted by this reference to recall the biblical story. The woman's subsequent opposition to the king's druid and her prophecy of the coming of Patrick suggests that, like Eve, quoting McCone, she can hardly be understood as anything but a symbol of the church. Although Hollow also makes the very attractive suggestion that she might otherwise be read as wisdom. Eve was interpreted in medieval allegoresis as a figure of the church, just as Adam prefigured Christ. As the church was thought of as the bride of Christ, so Eve was the bride of Adam and was born out of his side. However, there are notable differences. Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, leading to the couple's expulsion from the Garden of Eden and subjection to pain, labour, and mortality. The apple represented in our tale must be from the tree of life rather than from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The fruit that she gives to Connla does not bring the knowledge that leads to human suffering, but rather delivers freedom from hunger and access to, or at least the prospect of, eternal life. As a descendant of Adam, Connla had already gained knowledge of good and evil that led to humanity's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Here, the gift of an apple from the tree of life offered Connla, and by implication the reader, the possibility of regaining paradise. The first wrinkle in the allegorical interpretation is the clear sexual nature of the woman's advances, although I think that this has been adequately explained. It is true that while sexual imagery is rarely used positively in Christian allegory, it is not entirely incongruent with love of God. McCone invokes parallels in the Song of Songs and associated medieval commentary, and Hollow usefully compares Gregory of Nyssa's assertion that the soul is drawn to God as the body is to its likeness. Hollow also points to the repeated use of the word ulchora, longing, instead of other words signifying love or lust, and she argues that this points to Connla's spiritual rather than carnal desire for the woman. In a similar vein, Meyer suggests that this choice of wording indicates that our author was thinking of a Christian conceptualization of paradise as the true home of the soul. The idea is appealing, but we should not underplay the significance of the sexual element. It should be remembered that even the Song of Songs, although a canonical text, almost invariably caused consternation among clerics due to its sexual content. Indeed, Origen recommended that readers must be properly prepared for reading it, lest they interpret it carnally. In a similar vein, Jerome advised that the other books of Scripture be studied first, so that the student knows how to approach it in his spiritual reading. Thus, the dangers of sexual content were clear, and allegory was a way to moderate it, not encourage it. A yet more serious difficulty, however, lies with the allegorical interpretation as currently framed of Connla's destination as a land where there is only women and maidens, which must be linked to the land of women in Immerich Bran. Indeed, Bernhard Meyer, who also advocates an allegorical reading, describes the land of women as perhaps the most baffling feature of the tale. Nothing similar is found in any period in the Western tradition. McCone appears to view the land of women as a literary invention, and by way of justification draws a specific comparison with Gregory the Great's commentary on the Song of Songs, in which women at a wedding are interpreted collectively as the bride of Christ, and thereby with the church. However, the idea that our author or predecessor would have generated such a paradisical land populated by women from this Gregorian commentary is hardly compelling, especially given the reservations about the sexual nature of the Song of Songs expressed by the Church Father and our author's own unwillingness to talk openly about sex. Meyer offers another possible model, suggesting that it is derived from an apocryphal tradition which survives only in a single brief and somewhat uncertain reference in the Ethiopic Liber Requie Mariae, which may refer to a place set aside in paradise for women. This isolated and, as Meyer acknowledges, somewhat dubious example provides only a very tenuous link, however. And in any case, a place where women were kept separate from men is very different from a land of women in which women act as consorts for men. And we shouldn't underestimate the conceptual ground that would need to be covered here. Not only are the literary parallels scant and weak, therefore, but we would have to question why, in the absence of sound precedent, an 8th century ecclesiastical writer would have chosen to portray paradise as a land populated by women. Without a plausible external source for the land of women, it is more economical to conclude that it is a native concept. Indeed, there are numerous references to Gaulish and British offshore islands with supernatural associations, and as some of these islands were connected with female devotees or priestesses, an established insular tradition of an island of women, whether in storytelling or belief, is certainly plausible. We do not need to conclude, however, that it was a pre-Christian concept, although that's a possibility. Rather, it was conceivably invented by churchmen as a sort of wicked heathen belief akin to the sacrifice of children. In any case, the land of women appears to have been accepted as a real place in the early medieval period. It also appears in Imra Corrich Muile Dún, where it is presented as a land of sin and tedium, suggesting that the author of that tale was trying to debunk what was then a widely believed and somewhat dangerous concept. As we have seen, allegories allowed medieval exegetes to accommodate incongruent elements found in sacred biblical stories by interpreting them allegorically rather than literally, and we might postulate that the Irish writers such as ours applied the same method to non-biblical sources. I suggest, therefore, that the author expected the reader to apply the methods of allegories not just to the deciphering of the elements of the tale, but also to temper its more dangerous elements, such as the land of women. The description of the otherworld land seems to create inextricable links with the Garden of Eden, which demand that the text not be read in isolation, but rather that we seek a deeper level of understanding within the interpretive framework provided by Christian eschatology. Moreover, the woman's prophecy of the downfall of the Druids places conversion and salvation at the heart of the tale and invites us to see Conla's journey as prefiguring the journey of the Christian saints to paradise. In this allegorical reading, the land of women retains its unorthodox significance as understood by the tale's audience, but the wider context of the tale allows, even demands, that it be read allegorically as prefiguring paradise. The comparison is inescapable. Treating the text allegorically rather than allegorically, we are no longer faced with problems of the incongruity of the material, as this is a function of allegories. It allows the reader to recognize the morally unseemly and fuse it with their Christian belief. We do not have to choose between a literal and an allegorical reading, therefore, but we can, indeed must, do both without compromising either. Furthermore, an allegorical understanding suggests that the author and audience could have believed the material to be historically true while also reading it allegorically. This would have been a literary triumph. By taking known events, the author could have completely subverted the original meaning, whatever that was, and put them into the service of Christian teaching. The woman from the pagan otherworld who lures away the son of the king of Tara suddenly is transformed into the church that is offering eternal life to those who accept her invitation. Éachtra Chonla's historical setting varies according to the manuscript context, but is clearly present from the 10th century archetype and very possibly in the original. McCone's critical edition mentions only that the tale concerns Conla Ruaidh, son of Con Chéad Chathach, who would have been thought of course, as historical at the time. At the end of the tale, Conla disappears from sight, never to be seen again, and in this, McCone follows the authority of a single manuscript. All the other manuscripts, with one exception, which is developed even further, they round off the tale with a fuller historiographical statement, number 1 on your handout. Thus, we have here, in addition to Con Chéad Chathach, a reference to Art Éoin as another historical character, and an explanation of his name with its historiographical resonance. McCone chooses to follow YBL here in ignoring this statement, therefore, but not without justification, for Y sits on one side of his stemma while all the others sit on another branch. McCone's stemma is in number 2 there. You can see Y on the left and all the other ones on the right. As McCone concedes, there's nothing in the language of the fuller ending that would suggest that it is any later than the rest of the text, although to be fair, there's little in it that might prove diagnostic anyway. In the end, McCone is inclined to take Y as older because it appears to provide a neat linear progression from an abrupt ending through to L's more elaborate ending. But he does concede that this cannot be established as fact. In truth, the longer ending is just as likely to be original, and there's no telling which is the earlier. McCone attempts to derive some support for the precedence of the Y version from other sources, which explain art sobriquet in quite a different manner from Éachtra Chonla. The genealogies in the book of Léacht and Cor Anman tell us that Conley and another son, Crinne, were slain by Ochifin Fuathnart and Fiecha Suhye. This, despite its later attestation, has been taken as an older tradition about Conley's death, of which the current tale is an imaginative retelling. However, the dismissal of the miraculous or extraordinary as secondary smacks of modern rationalism. Reading between the lines, the argument is that the duller account is truly historical, whereas Eachtrach Conley is fictional, as if we are to believe in the historicity of a supposedly 3rd century version just because of the manner in which it's presented. We might equally argue that the more sober historical account was a rationalization and rejection of the fabulous story, as outlined in Eachtrach Conley, or that the two versions arose independently of one another. Priority certainly cannot be decided on the basis of our prejudice about what was regarded as plausible in the Middle Ages. So at least by Eachtrach Conley's 10th century node, and possibly as early as the 8th century, the tale was probably being treated as an historical event. And at the very least, we know that the appearance of Conchid Cathach, who occupies an unassailable position in Irish synthetic history, is indicative of an historiographical framework in the early version, in the original. Thus, history and allegory do not need to sit in opposition to one another. History is to be interpreted through an allegorical lens to reveal its real truth. And by reinterpreting in this way, the writer vindicates the history not just as factual, but as presaging salvation and the work of the Church. Krivostekova has recently explored a sophisticated level of allegory in some of the earliest Irish language tales. In Imre Bran, Bran encounters Manannán, whose poem presents two versions of the world in which the hero of the tale exists: the watery world that Bran sees from his boat, and the mysterious one under the waves, which Manannán drives his chariot around. The two worlds coexist simultaneously. Manannán's world is not situated in some other location, but it's sited within Bran's world, although in a different dimension. For Krivostekova, this double perception corresponds to different modes of exegetical reading: the literal or historical level of what happened, Bran goes to sea and meets Manannán, and the spiritual or allegorical level in which Manannán's world represents in some way the Christian heaven. I'm not sure if she means to take us to take the tale literally as a record of an historical event. Historical is always in inverted commas here. But I believe that here again, we have an overlap between historiography and allegory. The modern mind is conditioned to consider Imre Bran as a work of fiction. Its fantastical account of Bran's voyage and his encounter with Manannán invites just such a reading. However, similar voyages are recorded elsewhere as fact, such as Cormac O'Leithine's voyages recorded by Adamnan, in which his boat is attacked by insects the size of frogs, or the voyage of Brendan with his many wondrous events. What is now regarded as preposterous and incredible was then considered entirely plausible. Moreover, Imre Bran itself claims historicity. The end of the tale tells us that in Bran's return to Ireland, the people of Shrubren declare that they had the story of Imre Bran in their histories. This is number 3 on your handout. Bran then told of his travels from the beginning until his return to Ireland and wrote the poems out in Ogam. That's at the end of that citation in your handout there. Skrivish in Oruna sa tre Ogam. The writing down in Ogam of the verses is a common stratagem for explaining how the material presented to the reader was preserved from ancient times, as eloquently established by Eugene Age in Conversing with Angels. Poems are frequently presented in historiographical texts as corroborating evidence for the narrative. This is underlined by the subsequent statement that from that hour, his wanderings are not known. In other words, he never returned after that point, and so history ceased. Without a witness, history cannot be known. This all might be dismissed as a literary conceit to provide the tale with an air of verisimilitude. I don't think such a suggestion can be empirically disproved, but given that voyage tales would have been credible, we must entertain the likelihood that this one, like the others I have mentioned, was considered to have happened. The final historizing statement in number 3 in your handout is found only in the YBL copy and could have been introduced at any stage. However, evidence of an historical stance is provided by an often overlooked episode in the tale. Manannán tells us that he's going to Ireland to become the father of his son, who would be known as the son of Fiachna. This boy is known to us through a gloss and a wider complex of tales as Mungan mac Fiachna, whose fortune Manannán foretells here right up to and including his death. This episode has been dismissed as poetic hyperbole by Carney and as literary conceit by Charles Edwards, but it may well have been believed to have had some factual basis. Again, we shouldn't allow ourselves to be constrained by modern rationalism. Fiachna mac Buatin was king of Dalnaritha, and his death is recorded in the annals in 626. It's very likely to have been an historical character. And despite the bizarre appearances and folding in of myth, Mungan seems to have been considered so too. His death appears in the annals of Tigernach on the year 625, approximately a century or so before the likely date of authorship of the tale. Yet this whole episode is redolent of allegory too. McCone has already drawn attention to Manannán's Christ-like appearance. Oscamp drew parallels between an image deployed by Columbanus in a letter to Pope Boniface IV in 613 of Christ coming in a chariot over the sea to Ireland. McCone argues for direct influence, but it should be noted that the image in Imre Brand is much more profound than Columbanus's usage. Furthermore, as McCone remarks, Manannán's journey to beget Mungan parallels Christ's conception, quote, in an unmistakable allegory or typology. Christ is here represented by Mungan, and Manannán plays the role of God the Father. I don't believe that this is a mere passing resemblance, but is in fact quite profound. It is no accident that immediately before this disclosure, Manannán describes the results of the fall, the introduction of sin into the world, and the coming of Christ. Indeed, the birth of Christ and the conception of Mungan appear in almost the same breath, so the equation of one with the other is inescapable. This is number 4 on your handout, where the first stanza describes paradise, the next 3 stanzas describe the fall, the next stanza then describes the incarnation, and the final 2 stanzas describe, if I can say, the incarnation of Mungan. However, the description of Mungan is quite hyperbolic, describing how he will take on different shapes, and you can see that in number 5 of the handout. Within the context of Manannán's description of a duality consisting of this world and another world, Mungan's description as taking on a variety of shapes is quite striking here. It seems to suggest that he will take on a form suitable to his environment, both on sea and land. So he will be a wolf or a stag, a salmon, a seal, or a swan, depending on where he finds himself. As the land and sea correspond to Manannán's doubly viewed world, so Mungan, it seems to be suggested, will, like Manannán, occupy both. Thus, while mortals might have seen him as a man, in a deeper reality, he was a wolf, a stag, a seal, or a swan. Mungan, therefore, is drawn into the same allegorical model where he exists on at least 2 levels. He is a man made of flesh, but he is also the son of a god and a beast. Indeed, the first part of the poem, in which Manannán describes 2 parallel worlds, appears not as the main act, but as a prelude to the dual nature of Mungan. While scholarly attention has focused on the description of Manannán's land, the nature of Mungan is much more probably the point of the entire poem. For the introductory prose does not concern itself with the dual nature of the sea or other world, but instead highlights Mungan's birth. That's number 6 on your handout. Then the man sang another 30 quatrains to him, and named himself to him, and said to him that he was Manannán, son of Lur, and said that it was in store for him to go to Ireland after long ages, and that a son would be born to him, that is Mungan. So this is the prose introducing the poem. This is what the prose writer sees as significant within the poem. As McCone has cogently argued, this poem is integral to the tale, And both this poem and that uttered by the woman both contain 28 quatrains, so it could hardly be argued that any part of it is a later interpolation. So the poem shifts the narrative temporarily towards the imminent conception of an historical figure who would have lived not long before the tale was written, but who embodied the duality that Manannán so eloquently describes in the first part of the poem. God's work is written in history as manifested by Mongan. Incidentally, scholars have wondered at the statement at the end of the tale that I've already quoted, that the men of Shugbrin declare that they already have the voice Bran in their histories. A rationalist approach would suggest that this is either a mistake, such as suggested by Dunville but ably dismissed by McCone, or that they would just have known of the story up until the point of Bran's departure. However, given Mongan's preternatural knowledge and his prominence in the poem that we have just described, it seems more plausible that we're expected to know that Mongan had come to know the story by means of his mystical knowledge. They knew the story because Mongan had already revealed it. The purpose of Bran, then, retelling the story is to verify what had already become known through occult means. I will now turn to another tale, albeit a later one, in which two worlds collide. The story known as Adad Echach Macmeritha is a composite text which only partially deals with the death of Echach in the great inundation that created Loch Ness. The remainder of the text is concerned with the fate of his daughter, Leavan. Following the flooding of Loch Ness, Leavan continued to live under its water, protected in her bower by God. After years, she beseeched God to allow her to take the form of a salmon, and her wish was granted. 300 years later, as she was swimming in the sea, she was discovered by a certain Saint Biowan, who was on his way to Rome at the time. A year later, she was brought to land and housed in a great vat filled with water. She was asked whether she would prefer to live another 300 years or accept baptism and immediately go to heaven, and she chose the latter. Helen Imhoff has demonstrated that there are more than accidental resonance between the flood story and Leavan's redemption, and proposes that it would be considered a typological tale, with the flooding of Loch Ness being considered as a precursor to Leavan's baptism. The parallel with the flood is obvious, and Imhoff draws attention to the part in the prophecy uttered by the fool Cornan, in which he urges his people, number 7 on your handout, take sharp edges, carve vessels, which clearly echoes God's instruction to Noah to build an ark in preparation for the flood. This shows an author at work moulding an event to generate a parallel to the flood, and the bursting of Loch Ness is to be read typologically or allegorically. This allusion is embedded within the tale that is not itself an allegory, nor does Imhoff claim it as such, and shows that the author absorbed typological constructs in structuring the tale. Moreover, we need to consider the historiographical element of the tale. The opening deals with mythological or legendary event, namely the bursting forth of the lake, and was probably read as historical like the eruption of lakes described in Never Gavala. More importantly, her capture is noted in the Annals of Ulster on the year 572, number 8 on your handout, although not in the original. There she's called Murielch. Unsurprisingly, mermaids were thought to be real. The capture of 2 mermaids is recorded in the Annals of Ulster on the year 1118, and this is number 9 on your handout. Thus, the appearance of a woman who lived in the sea as a fish would have been quite plausible in the 12th century. Leavan's capture brings us into the Christian period, into the time of Saints Cumgall and Biowan, and to 572 if the annals are to be believed. In one poem, she addresses St. Brendan, who, it is implied, encountered her on his voyage and possibly died in the same year as her capture. In the prose, she becomes an object of wonder and almost certainly a token of God's mercy. She is put on display in a vat, number 10 in your handout, and crowds of people came to look at her while she was in the vessel surrounded by water. This is typical of the kind of wonders that most people would have accepted at the time as being true. Furthermore, we are told, this is number 11 on your handout, wonders and miracles are done through her there. Not only was she a wonder herself, but she was a virgin and a saint through whom miracles were worked after her death. Leavan's story is primarily historiographical, therefore, what would have been accepted as history. But her story is clearly seen as an act of God's mercy, and deliberate echoes are made to the flood and the saviour of Noah and his sons. She's made to live an extraordinarily long time in order to link the flood to her baptism, thereby linking the biblical deluge to baptism and salvation. I've argued here that it's not enough to evoke the vague idea of allegory to explain these tales, but that we need to understand the tales as a framing of a narrative understood through the lens of allegoresis. Once thus understood, allegoresis can be seen as a form of reading back, and it need not be placed in opposition to history. Indeed, it seems that these texts were cast as historical tales, at least from the 10th century, but most probably from their earliest composition. The author of Éachtro Chonlae may well have believed that the king's son was indeed whisked away to an island paradise, and the author of Imar Bran may well have believed in Bran's story. We should be cautious about imposing a rationalizing view on these stories. The medieval view, as formulated by Isidore, is that history related to true things that happen, res vera quae facte sunt, in contrast to fabulae, which concern things that have not happened and cannot happen because they are contrary to nature. There is nothing from a medieval perspective contrary to nature in what we have looked at today. And these events would have been deemed in the medieval period to be quite plausible. Allegory, therefore, rather than pointing towards their fictionality, underscores their perceived reality and invites the reader to seek a deeper meaning in the events of the past, which point towards the triumph of Christianity and the salvation of the Irish. Thank you.